Good evening. Welcome back to the Bible Speaks Today from LBC Television Ministries. And if you think, oh, that looks a bit strange, that's not what I'm used to, I should point out that we are using, I don't know why we have never done it before, but we're using the Sunshine Club set. You know, this city scene behind me was painted many years ago as part of the Sunshine Club set, and we used to use the other studio which has the bookcases in it. And one of the nice things about this ministry is that every so often we get new people who join or people who come to work for us, and they say, why do you do that? Why don't you do that? And we think, oh, I wonder why we don't do that. We've never done that before. So we're using this as a set. It's a little lighter for me, a bit more room. I don't feel like I'm hunched up in a closet somewhere. And there's also been some other technical changes with things. So if you see the odd glitch tonight, I'll apologize in advance because we're still getting used to. And I need to thank our graphics chap who, if you look at the graphics just coming up on the screen now, you'll see the graphics are much more easy to read, a little bit more self-explanatory. And again, God is very good to us because he gives us all these talents and they fit in. And you can't see this, and I'm not going to show it to you, but behind the cameras and the cameramen, there used to be in the corner of the studio this pile of what you would call rubbish and we call absolutely essential equipment that we don't use. I think that's the right example. You know, cables and stuff that we've, you know, DVD recorders that we've since, you know, superseded, this sort of thing. And one of our staff, who should remain nameless by her request, that tells you who she is, came in the other day and went through this like a dose of salts and tidied it all up and got rid of all the recyclable stuff and everything else. So we now have a much bigger studio than I thought we had. So we're doing very well. And of course, we're now back onto the Bible Speaks Today with the cities of the Bible and Jerusalem. And you know, the sad thing about bad weather, if there is such a thing as a sad thing, is that they cancel things, okay? So normally we record on a Tuesday night, and that's what we usually do. And then one night of the month we don't record because that's when the church has its leadership meeting and its deacons meeting and everything else. And a few of us are involved in those, so we don't record. So we cancelled one because of bad weather, and then the other day they had bad weather and cancelled it again. So we ended up using up all our pre-recorded DVDs down at the television broadcasting in Kentucky, which actually relays our stuff to the cable company. And so we're having to frantically record this on a Wednesday night. And for those of you who are regular churchgoers, in most churches, Wednesday night you have a service going on, and in this church's case we have our youth and our children's programs. So you can't hear it yet, but I can. Outside the studio, down the corridor and everything else, I can hear the pattering of tiny feet. Feels like a ton of elephants running through the place. And I'm quite sure that sooner or later one of them is going to bludgeon through the door despite the warning signs and everything else and come into here. So if I look startled at any time, that's what's happened, okay? The other problem with all of this is that because it's been delayed a couple of weeks, it's been 3 weeks since I sat down with you and continued the program. So whilst I know where I left off in my script notes here, what I don't remember is what I said 3 weeks ago. I know, I could get the DVD out and listen to it, but you know, the older you get, the more stubborn you get, right? So I'm just going to backtrack just a little bit. We're talking about, or we got to the point where the Muslims had taken over Jerusalem, the Muslims as we understand them today. And we're talking about the period all 650 to 960, something like that. And under the there's a few interesting things about this, you know, because we're coming up to the Crusades, and you all think you know what happened there, and you don't, because I'm about to shatter some myths here. But under the early centuries of Muslim rule, religious freedom in the city was practiced. City was full of Jews and Muslims, and everybody did their own thing, and there were mosques and there were churches and that sort of thing. And In fact, one of the in both of the two dynasties that one followed the other in that period of 650 to 960, the city really prospered. I mean, one of the geographers in the 10th century, Al-Iskatiri, described it as the most fertile province in Palestine. Now, if you've been to Israel recently or seen pictures of it, you'll know it's not walled. They've done a lot of trying to get the green back into the country, shall we say? And yes, there's lots of olive orchards and orange orchards and that, but basically there's a lot of desert there. But yet, back then, it was considered a very fertile presence. There was a chap called Al-Muqaddasi who was born in Jerusalem in 946, and he wrote a famous book in its time, famous book in its time, called The Best Divisions in the Knowledge of Climes, in other words, climates and that sort of thing. And he devoted a whole bunch of chapters to Jerusalem. So it was very popular. But here's the interesting thing. You do a bit of research and you find that under Muslim rule, Jerusalem didn't achieve the political or the cultural status enjoyed by the other capitals in the Middle East. Now, you would have thought that it had been an Israeli capital, Jewish capital, it had been capital in other places. It was still the capital of Palestine, such as it was, and this dual religion thing, Muslims and Jews and everybody else there, that you'd think it would be a really important place, but it wasn't. Baghdad, Damascus, and several of the other countries were much considered at that time, 10th century, much more important than Jerusalem. It's in our modern thinking, Jerusalem is like the most important city in the world, sort of thing. But it actually wasn't. Kind of interesting. Another thing I found out, that Al-Muqaddasi, whose name gets his name from the Arabic name from Jerusalem, which was Beit al-Muqaddas, which means which Beit is the word for house, of course, linguistically equivalent, if you like, in the Hebrew, to Beit ha-Mikdash, which is the holy house. So it's funny that the Arabic name for the place was almost as close as the Jewish name. Well, then, as I say, up until the 10th century, a great deal of Arab tolerance about the religion, the worship of religion, and everyone was kind of free to go. It must have been a pretty good time in Jerusalem at that time. Well, then the Fatimids took over. It's called the Fatimid Caliphate period, but it in the early 11th century. In the early 11th century, the Egyptian Fatimid Caliph al-Hakim, never mind too much about the names, there's no questions about them afterwards, but this gentleman, for some reason or other, ordered the destruction of all the churches, not the mosques, the churches. In other words, a big clampdown on other religions. And in 1033, there was an earthquake. It's funny, you'd be surprised, but earthquakes happen in that part of the country, which severely damaged the big mosque, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which of course exists today, but the original mosque was severely damaged. And then the next Fatimid Caliphate, between 1034 1036, completely rebuilt the mosque, reduced it in size actually from 15 to 7 naves, and put some arcades in, and made this large gabled roof put in, which was mostly of wood. So the mosque was the big thing, the churches have been erased, and here we now come to the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Crusader period. That wonderful film with, I forget his name now, but anyway, that film, The Kingdom of Heaven, was set in that period of time. And what happened, or just after this period of time, what happened was that the Crusaders conquered Jerusalem in 1099. Now, before you think, and most people do, that the Crusaders were a bunch of of religious-minded chaps who got together and said, hey, those nasty Egyptian caliphates have destroyed all the churches and we need to go and get it back. It wasn't quite like that. What you had in 1050, 1060, that period of time, was Europe that was almost starving to death. You had bands of knights and their followers, little small armies, if you will, running around pillaging at will because there was no war to fight. There was no, England versus the rest war. There was no Spain versus Italy, no France versus whoever. There were no wars. So all these little potentates were running around, basically being a pain in the backside, but also causing a lot of problems. I mean, there was a time when they went all ballistic and started killing all the Jews for some reason or other. And your history books will bear that out if you bother to read them. And Pope Urban, the Roman Catholic Pope at the time, Pope Urban looked at this and I don't know whether he was prompted by religious zeal or whether he was a well-advised person who thought, this isn't doing very well. How about all you chaps going out to Jerusalem and getting it back for us? And while you're there, if of course you conquer any land, then it becomes yours and you can rule it and get the heck out of Europe, basically. If you like, it was an urban development project on a global scale, okay? So the Egyptians, and I'm not going to go into the Crusades in a great deal of detail. There's enough books written about them. It's enough quasi-true stories and inaccurate accounts written of the Crusades. But let's say that eventually all these Crusader knights and people got together and formed a formidable army and eventually captured Jerusalem in 1099. And the first thing they did was killed almost all of the Muslim and Jewish inhabitants, and in fact a whole bunch of other people as well. It was a terrible thing to have happen, and one I'm sure that the church in history is not terribly proud about, because these are supposed to be Christians, Christian knights, Christian armies. Okay, so it was a very bad move, because after all, if in fact you just went in and killed how many thousands of Muslim inhabitants of the city, and incidentally you notice that the Jews were still there despite the fact all the churches had been demolished. One assumes the synagogues were still there, or maybe they weren't. But anyway, there's a big Jewish population there, and they killed all the Jews as well. Now bear in mind they've been doing that in Europe before Pope Urban sent them off to Palestine. But they declared the area to be the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And in fact, they didn't just conquer Jerusalem, they conquered Antioch and they conquered, all the other cities in the area. Okay, so European knights, mostly German and French, but some English. If you read the rich story of Richard the Lionheart, you'll come across that. Captured the whole country and called it the Kingdom of Jerusalem, where you get the name the Kingdom of Heaven from. And a chap called Godfrey of Bouillon, which is French, was elected the Lord of Jerusalem, under I don't know which king it would be, but on the 22nd of July 1099. But he didn't get there to take the crown, and died a year later. So before he got there, so the barons. Now we're talking about barons, which is that these just like the barons in England, the local lords, the leaders of these bands of crusaders, offered the lordship of Jerusalem, which meant the ruler of the country, to Godfrey's brother Baldwin, who was the Count of Edessa. Again, not English. We all think that the Crusaders were all English. Not a bit of it. They're more French and German than anybody else. And he had himself crowned on Christmas Day 1100 in the Basilica at Bethlehem. At Bethlehem, mind you, not in Jerusalem. I got a note here to mention his leprosy. He was a leper, would you believe? Even though he was the king, he had leprosy, which was not unheard of in those days. And if you see the Kingdom of Heaven movie, which there are some wild inaccuracies in it, and a truncation of time, obviously, to fit the movie, and the main characters are probably conglomerations of several different people. But it's an interesting movie if you want to see what it was like in Jerusalem and what the Crusades were like, and the relationship between Arabs and Christians during that time. Most of the main characters, Sir Aladdin and Baldwin and people like that, are in the movie, and they're quite good. I wouldn't say it's a historical film by any means, but it's well worth watching. Okay, and what happened then is all these people starving to death in Europe said, hey, headed out to Jerusalem, headed out to Israel, Palestine, anyway, because they set about building up all the popular shrines encompassed or associated with the life of Christ. Many, in fact, nearly all of the famous places that you visit when you go to the Holy Land today, you know, where Jesus did this or where Jesus did that, and where the Mother Mary was born, this sort of thing, are all well known now because of the work done by the people who followed the Crusaders. Now, the Crusaders set about building castles. And, of course, the style of castles they built were the same ones as they built in Europe. They didn't build the sandstone forts so popular with the Arab culture. They built the big old stone castles that they were familiar with in Europe on the highest piece of ground they could find. And so when you visit the Holy Land, the Crusader castles, there's a wonderful book by T.E. Lawrence, same gentleman who was the so-called Lawrence of Arabia. There's a wonderful book by him called Crusader Castles, that before the First World War, he was at liberty to go around and see them all, you know, before they fell into even more disrepair than they are now. And some of them are restored beautifully. But it was a big thing. It was the old castle and then the serfs and the peasants working in the fields, just like it was back in Europe. Muslim shrines, such as the Al-Aqsa Mosque and on the Dome of the Rock on Temple Mount, were converted for Christian purposes. So they became Christian worship centers, if you will. Not destroyed, just converted. And it's during this period of basically, I want to say Frankish, that's the generic term for French-German occupation. Most of these big knights were French and some German. It was during that period that the orders of the Knights Hospitaller and the orders of the Knights Templar had their beginnings. Now, if you remember, what they were initially, especially the Knights Hospitaller, their job was to protect the pilgrims on their way to, in other words, you know, we're a pilgrim bunch, we've set off from Bristol in England, and we're going to go and visit the Holy Land, okay? So they take months and months to get there. And of course, they're subject to being all the way across Europe, being raided by bandits and that sort of thing. This is a fairly lawless time, 10th century, 10th, 11th century. When they get to the Holy Land, of course, they have these Knights Hospitaller who provide places for them to stay and be fed and rest up, and the Knights Templar provided, if you like, military protection. Now, we could go into lots of detail about those two orders. Let's provide do a whole series on the Knights Templar and what happened to them, and all the conspiracy theories books that have been written about that. But not for this program. But there was a tremendous influence of pilgrims going out to Jerusalem. Okay. Now the kingdom of Jerusalem lasted until about 1291. So about 120 years, basically. Okay. But Jerusalem actually was recaptured before then, about 1187. So it was quite a long time before the rest of the country went down, because although the Arab armies conquered Jerusalem, they could not defeat all the different Crusader castles and things like that. But Saladin, okay, that's his real name, not all one word, in 1187 captured Jerusalem. And again, if you want to see how that was done to a certain extent, watch the movie, because that's about the best account you'll get, or the best, visual account you'll get of it. Okay? Then he, although the movie has everybody leaving those who want to, I suppose, leaving the city, he allowed worship of all religions. According to Rabbi Elijah of Chelm, and he wrote an account of it, there were German Jews living in Jerusalem during the 11th century. And there were evidence of German communities in the city, because there were several letters sent from Germany to Jerusalem during the latter half of the 11th century with questions about religion and this sort of thing. So there obviously was a Jewish and probably a Christian community in Jerusalem. And as I say, initially under Saladin, the practice of different religions was allowed. A lot different. And I think one of the things that makes the film I've been talking about stand out a bit better was that whereas when the Christians conquered Jerusalem, they slaughtered nearly everybody in the place, when the Arabs conquered it back, they didn't. They just let people leave who wanted to, and the rest of them stay there. Anyway, in 1173, and the reason I'm giving you the dates is trying to give you a chronological order, a gentleman called Benjamin of Tudela visited Jerusalem, and he describes it, and this is his description, as a small city full of Jacobites, whoever they are, Armenians, Greeks, and Georgians. And it says that 200 Jews dwelt in a corner of the city under the Tower of David. Okay, so there's a small Jewish community there. Now, remember what I said in previous broadcasts about city walls, how important they are in this sort of culture? You remember how when Nehemiah and Ezra's, their big job with building after they built the temple was to put the walls back up again, because without city walls the place is basically indefensible. Okay, we don't do that sort of thing now, but up until the late Middle Ages, in fact later than that, if you look at any major city in England, it has city walls and places and gates through them. A good example is Canterbury, the town of Canterbury. There's about 5 city gates there, and you can still see most of the walls, because the only way you've got to defend people coming in is walls. Otherwise, they just march straight through. Okay, because nowadays we have much more horrible ways of stopping them. Okay. Anyway, in 1219, okay, the Muzam, that's the only way I can pronounce it, Muzam, who was the Abbeyid Sultan of Damascus, who was probably ruling Jerusalem at this time, had the walls knocked down, raised, meaning flat, down, everything gone. And they did that. It's kind of interesting. They did that as if you like, in the expectation of having to give the city up to the Crusaders as part of a peace treaty. Because if you read the story of the Crusades, they conquer Jerusalem, they have a kingdom. Some of them still stay there after the Arabs get it. Then 100 years later they come and take it back again. Or they have a peace treaty and the Arabs have to give it back up again. And in 1229, by a treaty with Egyptian's ruler Al-Kamil, Jerusalem comes into the hands of Frederick II of Germany. Okay, he's a crusader, but he's German. Okay? They had a 10-year truce. And what part of the truce is, okay, give us back Jerusalem, we won't build the walls up again for 10 years. In other words, we won't arm it and fortify it and be a threat to you. So in the minute that 10 years are up, in 1239, he begins to begin the walls again. Okay? And then the Emir of Kerak, which is a place near Jerusalem, comes back in the same year and knocks them down again. No, you're not going to have that. We're not going to have that. In 1243, Jerusalem comes into the... He took Jerusalem back, I should say then. In 1243, Jerusalem once again becomes into the power of the Christians, and the walls were built up again. Okay. In 1044, a year later, 1244 rather, the Khwarezmian Empire, which is the Arab Empire, took the city in 1244. They in turn were knocked out of it by the Ayyubids in 1247. So for that 20, 30 years, Jerusalem went backwards and forwards, the walls went up, the walls went down. It really was a bad place to be. And in 1260, the Mongols, would you believe, all the guys from Russia, under Hulagu Khan, engaged in raids into Palestine. Now, it's unclear, we don't know whether they got as far as Jerusalem, because, would you believe, at that time, it was not seen as anything of big consequence. It wasn't important. Nobody needed it. All right? And so we'll pick up on that again next week. We're running out of time. Jerusalem, of all the cities in the world, seems to have suffered more trial and turmoil than most capital cities. And we'll see where that leads us to next week. In the meantime, keep your Bible handy, read up. I'll see you next week. God bless.